Hello and welcome. This is a Sinclair ZX81, a very budget home computer released in March 1981 by Sinclair Research of Cambridge in the UK. Now, Sinclair was famous for engineering his products to a low price point. He did that with some clever engineering, but also by sacrificing technical capabilities and maybe the build quality. But nevertheless, the low price of Sinclair computers enabled many people to get their first start in the field, including me. One of these, along with the excellent included basic programming manual, was how I got my first start in computing. Now, this isn't my original ZX81. I bought this one recently from eBay. So the first thing I'm interested in is, does it actually still work? And if it does, I'd like to find out if my first home computing experience was as good and as bad as I remember. Now, this video isn't going to be about the full history and technical specifications of the ZX81, but more about the difficulties in connecting one of these up in 2019. And if I can resolve those, then maybe we can play a game of 3D Monster Maze. Being a budget home computer from the early 1980s, you probably aren't expecting the ZX81 to have much in the way of connectivity, and you certainly wouldn't be wrong. On the left-hand side, there's a socket for a 3.5mm mono jack plug, which is where you plug the included 9V DC power supply. Behind that is another pair of 3.5mm sockets for plugging the ear and mic connectors of a tape recorder to load and save programs. Now, according to the manual, if you accidentally plug the power supply into the tape recorder sockets, then you don't damage the computer, but I'm not planning on finding that out. Behind that is a phono connector that outputs a black and white TV signal. Now, this being a UK ZX81, it outputs a PAL UHF signal on channel 36. Behind that, you can just see a little scored area, which is where the phono connector for the North American version would be fitted. The only other connector is on the rear of the computer, and that's the edge connector that we would plug a memory expansion or printer into. So it looks like we're stuck with the analog TV output. And while an analog TV output was absolutely fine in the early 1980s, it's now 2019 and about 10 years after digital switchover in the UK. So finding a TV that you can plug into this is becoming increasingly difficult. Okay, so I've raided the kitchen and I've stolen the 24-inch LCD TV we have in there. This has a whole wealth of digital and analog inputs, and in particular both digital and analog tuner input. So to connect the ZX81, it came with this cable, which has a phono connector on one end that goes in the ZX81's TV output. And then we plug this cable, we commonly call an aerial cable, but apparently the real name for it is a Belling-Lee connector. That plugs into the antenna input on the back of the television. And to connect the power to the ZX81, you need the 3.5mm jack off the included 9V power supply, and that goes in the DC input socket, just here. Okay, so I've got everything connected up and switched on. It's actually difficult to tell if the computer's doing anything at all. There's no LED, there's no fan or anything that tells me it's even powered up, so it could be completely dead. The TV is displaying a static picture, so let's try tuning it in. So go to the antenna menu, manual tuning, analog, channel. I can type in 36, which is a heck of a lot easier than it was back in the early 80s, I remember. And there we go, that was pretty easy. It's sort of auto-tuned itself, found a picture, and that looks good. Except it doesn't really, that's a bit disappointing. The screen's very grey, there's lots of interference. If you don't know what a ZX81 should look like when it first turns on, it should have a white screen with an inverse letter K in the corner showing it's in keyword entry mode, where I can press something like P to type print. But it's good to know that the computer actually works, which is something I was concerned about. But the picture's really not very good. There's a lot of sort of smearing and things here. I don't know if this can be fixed perhaps with some manual fine tuning. There is an option for that on this TV. Let's go to fine tune. That's not really helping. Let's try going the other way. Well, that's certainly brightening the picture, but it's got a lot of interference in the background and the letters are still very, very smeared, so the picture really isn't very good at all. I'll save that because it's a bit nicer than it was before, but it really isn't a nice picture. I don't think I'd want to use this for more than a few minutes. So I'm a bit unsure what the problem is here. I mean, it could be my television. I've never used this with an analog source before, or it could be the ZX81. Or I suppose it could be the cable, but I probably need to go away and do some research. Okay, so I've done a bit of digging and it seems this problem isn't at all uncommon. The ULA, which is the chip inside the ZX81 responsible for generating the video signal, apparently doesn't generate a clean level of black voltage after the synchronization pulse between each scan line of the TV signal, the so-called back porch part of the signal. Now this didn't upset TVs of the day, but it does upset modern TVs, and they're unable to correctly determine the voltage between the dark and the light areas of the picture, resulting in an image that's very grey and murky. Now this was fixed on later versions of the ZX81 with an updated ULA, but taking a peek through the expansion connector of mine and having a look at the arrangement of components suggests I've got one of the early ones. Okay, so the articles that told me about the problem with the back porch told me about this product here, which is called the ZXvid, and this supposedly solves the problem. So I ordered one of these, and this is what arrived, nicely packed in an anti-static bag. And it's a little circuit board. Now this apparently goes inside the RF modulator that's in the ZX81 and not only fixes the back porch problem but also changes the output. So instead of it being an RF TV output, it's going to be a composite video output, which will be a lot easier to connect up to a modern TV. Okay, I've got one ZX81 with a dodgy video output, one ZXvid module, set of instructions off the internet. It's time to break out the screwdrivers and the soldering iron. Okay, so I've managed to desolder the modulator from the main circuit board. This was quite difficult because of these two pins on the bottom. They're soldered through 2 points in the board, and when you heat up the solder, then the whole modulator case acts like a massive heat sink, so it's very difficult to get enough heat on it. And eventually I had to break out a big old bruiser of a soldering iron to melt that and get it off. I hope I haven't damaged the board, but I'm certainly not the neatest at soldering. Anyway, this is the old modulator from the board, which used to fit under here like that. And now I've got to remove the innards and swap them out for the replacement one. Okay, I've finally managed to remove the old modulator circuit board from the modulator case. That wasn't very easy for a similar reason to the removing the modulator from the board. There's a lot of solder around the edge that secures the board into the bottom of the modulator case, about 5 points, and again, when you heat the solder up, you're basically heating this up and this case up, and that gets very hot, and so it's firstly difficult to hold, and secondly acts as a kind of heat sink. There were also a couple of parts of the instructions that were missing. One of those was that there's a wire coming off this component here in the modulator that's soldered onto the center pin of the phono jack there, so that meant the board was kind of obviously fixed in there, so that needed to be desoldered. And also one of the wires that comes out of the side of the modulator, the one that comes through here, was fixed because this little hole actually had lots of solder in it, and so it was necessary to sort of pry the board loose and then pull the board out while heating the solder up in there to slide everything through. But I've got it out now, and I don't think I've wrecked the case. Okay, so I've fitted the ZXvid module inside the modulator. The two wires on this side of the board poke out through the holes. This one, which had the solder in it, and I had the problem getting the wire out, that one I've just had to sort of clean that out by poking a screwdriver through just to clean the solder out of the hole. The wire that comes out of the top of the board, labelled vid out, has to be soldered onto the pin there for the phono connector, and then this 0-volt wire has to be soldered somewhere onto the inside of the modulator because that's connected to 0 volts when it's soldered to the circuit board. Okay, so the circuit board is now wired into the modulator case. The vid out cable, it connects to the center pin of the phono connector, and the 0 volts is soldered to the edge of the case. It was quite hard to get that to stick, I think probably because of some sort of coating or finish on the metal, but anyway, that's now fixed there. So the next thing to do is install it on the circuit board of the computer again. Okay, so the modulator is now fixed to the circuit board again. I had to put it through those two terminals again. It's a lot easier getting it back because there's not the big heatsink to heat up when I was taking it off. I haven't put any extra solder on there just at the moment in case I have to remove it again for some reason. But the board's in there. The two wires that come out have been soldered to the 2 points on the board. One goes here and the other one goes here. So I was just able to heat those up and fix the wires in. So I think everything's soldered on enough just to test things and see if it basically works. So I'll fire things up and see how they get on. Okay, now we've done the hardware modification, it's time to test this out. So to connect a TV, I now need a phono to phono cable because this should output a composite video signal. One end of this goes into a display. Now my monitor happens to have a composite input here, and the other end goes in the same TV output socket on the ZX81 that the aerial cable went in previously. Before I power it up, I'll just change the input on my monitor to composite and the screen goes blank. So I'll plug in the 9-volt DC power supply and then connect up the power jack, and this is the moment of truth. And I've got a white screen with a black K on it, and it looks a heck of a lot better than it did before. The background is a very clean white and the K is black. There's a little bit of ghosting around the K. I wouldn't say terrible, but I think it's probably down to the fact that the monitor is expecting a composite color signal and probably the ZX81's outputting a mono signal, so the monitor's trying to derive color information from the signal. But there is some screws on the top of the ZXvid module which you can adjust apparently to tweak the image, so I'll have a go at those and see what happens. Okay, so according to the documentation you can adjust the picture slightly by twiddling these screws on the top of the ZXvid board. One of these is supposed to adjust the sort of contrast and brighten, and the other one the sort of brightness. So I'm just going to try twiddling these and see what happens. The documentation says it's about 20 turns from one end to the other. I'm turning that one, and what I'm really noticing is that the K is becoming a bit fainter. If I turn it back, then the K, the screen is all becoming dimmer and lines are appearing, so that's probably not the right way to go. Let's go back the other way. So somewhere in the middle here is probably good. I suppose what I'm trying to do is get the background very bright and but the K probably still quite dark. If I turn it up too far it probably washes everything out. Anyway, that looks pretty good. Let's try the other one and just see what that does. So this one seems to be making the picture looks a little bit clearer, but the lines are appearing. Let's turn it the other way. And it's making the K more blurred. Let's try going back again then. So I guess it's all just a kind of a matter of preference here. That's definitely looking, I don't know, if I combine that with this one maybe it will look better. So that probably looks pretty good. It's difficult to say. I don't have any text on the screen, but it's difficult to put any text on the screen when you don't have a keyboard. So anyway, that looks pretty good, I think. So unfortunately, to plug the keyboard back in sort of requires reassembling it. So I guess I might need to reassemble it and then realise it doesn't look very good. Anyway, that looks pretty good as far as I can tell, so I think I'll stop there. Okay, so before we put things back together again, I thought it'd be worth just having a quick look at the board. There's not much on it. The chip here is the Z80 CPU. This is the Ferranti ULA, which is the thing that replaced most of the circuitry on the ZX80 and does all sorts of things, including generate the video signal. This chip, I believe, is the ROM. That's where the BASIC is stored. And then this chip over here is the 1K RAM chip. Down here are the connectors for the keyboard ribbon cables. At the back is the expansion connector where you plug in memory or a printer. And here, of course, is the modulator that we've replaced with a composite video board. This is the ear socket, the mic socket, and the 9-volt DC input. And this is the voltage regulator, and hanging off there you can just see there's a large metal heatsink which seems to get quite warm when the computer's running. So there's not really a lot to it. Okay, so just finishing things off before we put them back in the case. I've put the case on the modulator. I was a little worried because the board inside there was a bit smaller and lower than the original circuit board, and I thought it might rattle around when I shake it, but there is a slight noise, but I don't think it's worth particularly worrying about. It can't go very far, like a millimetre in each direction, and there's enough play on the cables, that's not an issue. Just as a matter of interest as well, you can see it says issue 1 on the motherboard there, so it's one of the original ones, and that's why I've got the problem with the ULA in the first place. The only other thing I've quickly done to finish things off is I put an extra bit of solder on the 2 pins that hold the modulator case onto the motherboard, just to give it a bit of extra support, because I took a lot of that off when I was unsoldering the case, and just a quick dab of solder on the 2 terminals where the wires were put in, just to make sure they were properly fixed. But otherwise I think we're all good to reassemble things now. Okay, now that the ZX81 is reassembled and hopefully still working, what I thought I'd also try is what I think is probably a very common way that many people use to get a composite signal into a modern display, which is through one of these converter boxes. Now, these are available for about £15 to £20 on Amazon and come in a variety of different models, but the one I have here has a SCART socket on the side which can take either S-Video, RGB or composite, and then can convert it into HDMI. And there's a push button here where you can choose a variety of different resolutions, and despite the fact that says 720p and 1080p, you can actually pick a variety of other resolutions like 1280 by 1024 or 800 by 600 or whatever your screen happens to take. It also has an HDMI input, so you can select between that and the SCART to just act as a kind of switch box if you need an additional input. Using it is pretty straightforward. You plug the cable that you want to connect to your display into the HDMI output on the back. If you have something like a composite signal, you can plug it into this sort of SCART adapter thing here. That then plugs into the SCART socket on the front, and then just plug the power in. And it takes a little moment to start up and detect the signal, and when it's done that, it should output a picture which appears on your display. The only thing I'd say it's a bit annoying is it does display this sort of status box that you can't get rid of and sits there for about 10 seconds, so it's quite annoying when you change resolutions or connect something up and that appears. But what I would say is that the picture I've got out of this is probably the best I've had out of any type of input. It certainly beats plugging the composite cable directly into the monitor. I get a very nice, sharp, stable picture with very clean whites, very dark blacks. Everything seems very good. What I have done is I've taken some close-up shots with a macro lens of the TV when it's displaying a picture using the composite input on the monitor directly. Also the picture generated on the same monitor by using this converter box. And also I've fed the composite signal directly into the TV that I used earlier to show you what the picture looks like from that. And that is also equally as good, I would say, as the converter box itself. Okay, one last thing I thought I'd show you, just to give you an idea of the quality of the video coming out of the ZX81 now, is to capture some directly. So I've got the ZX81 with the composite output going into the converter, and then the HDMI output from the converter going into my capture device. The capture device is capturing the data over USB to the computer and also feeding a signal onto the monitor. So I'll show you some video captured from that directly now. Okay, so here's some video captured directly from the HDMI output of the converter. It's a basic programming listing, and you can see that the picture is very good. The whites are white, the blacks are very black, the text is extremely readable. One what's being shown here is the listing for a simple basic program that plots a sine wave, but it gives you an idea of the legibility of the text, including the inverse characters on the comment in line 5. The only thing I would say that's a downside about this output is that the text tends to curve in towards the right at the top of the screen. So if you look at the edges of the inverse characters for sine wave in the comment on line 5, you can see that they aren't quite vertical, they sort of bend in towards the right. If I run the program to give you an idea of the graphics, you also get an idea of the speed of the ZX81 when I do this in BASIC. So it's plotting a sine wave. You can see that the image is extremely stable. The pixels are very clear. It's certainly a lot better than it was, and very impressive for a picture from 40 years ago. So I'm very happy with that. The text that's just being plotted and the little graphics characters are to give you an idea of the sort of finest pixel resolution of the ZX81 display. The first set of grey blocks at the bottom there is the ones you get in graphics mode with Shift A, and the second set with Shift H. And the little dots there are individual pixels of the text resolution. And the A's and H's don't line up correctly, which is why you get a sort of a little row of bars down between the two sets of grey boxes. The bit slightly to the right with the sort of more coarse checkerboard pattern of the 4 pixel by 4 pixel graphics characters, and then to the right of that are the numbers showing the Y line numbers in the text mode, just to give you an idea of the legibility of the text. So overall I'd say that's a great success, and the picture's certainly extremely readable and a lot better than it was. Right, so now we're on to what I think is the most important bit about this whole exercise, which is can I play 3D Monster Maze on my newly repaired ZX81? So I've got my tape and my WH Smith tape recorder, and before I can load it up though, I'll need to put on my memory expansion. Now the keen-eyed amongst you might have noticed when I was showing you the computer earlier that there's a little bit of hook and loop fastener on the back here, and that helps the memory expansion stay on there. So the memory expansion pushes into the back here, and to stop it wobbling off there's a little bit of hook and loop on the back there. So we'll squish that on, pop it down here, connect up the tape recorder. So I need to put the mic socket in, ear socket in, composite video signal, and plug in the power. And my computer's on, so we'll pop the tape in. Got the volume set to a good level. Just wait for the message to disappear. And this box is quite annoying, but it does go away. So load, J, Shift and P twice, press return, and that's the searching screen, and hopefully the ZX81 will find the program on the tape and then it will load. So let's see if it does. And there's something there, and there we go, it's loading. Now one of the problems with the ZX81 is that it can't maintain the display whilst it's devoting all its CPU time to reading the signal off the tape. So the screen is likely to stay in this no signal state for the next few minutes, but hopefully at the end of it we'll have a program that's loaded. So time for a bit of tea, I think. Well, there we go. Looks like it's loaded, and I'm being badgered. Right, let's give this a go. Now, when I first played this game back in the early 80s, I actually loaded it up several times and thought it had crashed every time I've loaded it, because it always got to this stage and the screen went blank. But it's just that the ZX81 has 2 modes, slow and fast, and in fast mode it disables the screen to devote all the CPU time to doing computation. and it does that while it generates the maze. So now the maze is generated, the screen's back up and we're ready to play. So using the ZX81 cursor keys, let's see where we get to. I remember being scared absolutely witless by this game when I was about 10. I think it's the fact there's no sound is very unnerving. There's no map, you just have to remember everything in your head. And you get these little clues at the bottom of the screen to tell you where Rex is. And the exit is always down a cul-de-sac, so you have to sort of find all the dead ends in the map. Oh God, you've seen me. Oh no, it's right beside me. So we can probably see him approaching here. It's pretty scary when you're 10, that is. There's the exit. First time. Anyway, I'd say this has been a successful adventure. So thanks very much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed that and found it useful. If you did, this is the first one of these I've done, so a little comment or a like may be good to encourage me to do some more of these. I've got all sorts of junk in here that I could do further talks about if you found it interesting. Anyway, thanks for watching and good luck if you try this yourself.